In the Gospel of John, of God's Word, you find that there are 7 signs that are there. And each one of these signs is meant to help us to believe in Jesus, help us to have greater faith in Jesus. And today, specifically, the story that we're going to look at has a little bit of a twist. Because the twist on it is really, the purpose of this sign is certainly to have belief in Jesus, have greater belief in Jesus. But more importantly than that, it's to teach us how to remove one of the biggest barriers that Christians, many of you, one of the biggest barriers that Christians create to keep somebody from Jesus. And maybe you've been a victim of this, what I'm about to mention to you. Maybe you've been a perpetrator of it. But what I'm referring to is simply this. It is a tendency of ours, and as we're going to look at in this text of the religious leaders, there is a tendency to get so focused on the commandments, the rules, the directives of God, and that becomes all we communicate to people, specifically people who need it, who we want to share with it, who we want to buy into it. We get so focused on the commandments that we forget to have compassion. And you've experienced this in other ways, in different forms in your life. I know I have. Let me give you a couple of examples. Maybe you can relate to a few of them. I can remember a time where I pulled up to school, and as I was pulling up to school to drop off my child, we were a little bit late, 30, 45 seconds. My child gets out of the car, the teacher's at the door, and what does the teacher do? The teacher didn't wait there for my kid. Instead, the teacher looked at my child, looked at me, walked inside, and shut the door because we were late. Now, you may not know how that works out from there, but what that essentially means is at that point, I have to put my child back in the car, pull into the parking lot, park my car, walk the kid in, sign the kid in, and so now my kid, instead of being maybe a minute late, is now 6-7 minutes late, and then my whole morning's thrown off. Now, was that teacher right? Yeah, that's the rule. But were they compassionate? No. Did that leave me feeling good about that teacher? No. Did that make me feel good about the school? No. Did it ruin the rest of my day? Probably. It wasn't a great situation. Or maybe you can relate to this. You've got a child or a grandchild on a plane. Maybe you've got a couple of them with you. I don't usually have them with me. My wife has them, but she does a great job, I'm telling you. So one of them is crying. The other ones want your attention. It's kind of chaotic. And then the stewardess walks by and says, sir, you're going to have to, or ma'am, you're going to have to get that bag 2 more inches under that seat. Just 2 more inches, because that bag is affecting a whole lot of people on that plane. That bag is going to bring the plane down. No, of course not. But I tell you what will affect people on that plane is that kid that keeps on crying that I can't take care of because I'm worried about a bag that's not 2 inches under a seat. Now, here's the deal. Is that the rule? Yes, of course. But is that compassionate? No. The only thing that matters in that moment is getting that kid calmed down so that way the rest of the flight doesn't have a crying baby. Or here's another example. This is more personal from my perspective. I was in a college ministry early on in ministry, and actually at this point I was just a volunteer. I was getting ready to finish up my master's degree and then be hired on at a church. But as I was finishing up at this particular church, there was a larger college ministry, but there was a girl in the ministry that for one reason or another I began to see, and I didn't know her at all. I'd never had a conversation with her, but I saw her in the ministry, and then I would see photos that she posted on social media. And most of the photos that she posted on social media had her drinking. And she was rather provocative in what it was she was doing, and she was partying very hard. And so I got the idea to send her a message on social media. And I didn't know her. I mean, other than seeing her, she knew of me, I knew of her, but I didn't have a relationship with her. And so I get online and I send her this message and I say, hey, it seems like you're really drinking a lot. You're really not giving God glory with your life. You need to get your act together. What it is that you are doing is not giving yourself a great image to other people. You're making people look at you for all the wrong reasons. And oh yeah, by the way, that Dixie cup in every photo that you're running around with, that who knows what you're drinking out of, doesn't give the best image of yourself. And you're made in the image of God. And I said some other very, very spiritual things. And then I sent the message. Well, it didn't take long for her friends to be calling me, because I did know some of her friends, to call me and tell me how rude that was, how inappropriate it was, how I should have never sent that message. Now, was I wrong? I don't think so. I think I assessed the situation pretty accurately. She was probably drinking too much, and she definitely shouldn't have been posting photos like that. But I wasn't compassionate at all. And I didn't have the relationship to speak that kind of truth into her life. And there could have been probably 5 or 6 other ways that I could have approached that situation that would have helped it, other than the one that I did. And here's what I want you to understand, is you've got something that the world needs. It's called truth. And right now, maybe more than ever, the world needs God's truth to be spoken into different spaces and areas of our lives like never before. But if we aren't willing to be compassionate about it, that truth is never going to make it through. And God's kingdom is never going to advance. We need boundaries, we need directives, we need guidance, like unlike any other time that I can imagine in my short life and probably in many of your lives. But if we aren't compassionate as a people, then that truth will again never get through to the people that it so desperately needs to get through to. And this passage of scripture that we're going to look at today, God's word again that we're going to dive into, is going to teach us what it is that Jesus was trying to teach those religious leaders so many years ago. And so in John chapter 5, verse 1, this is where it begins. Sometime later, and sometime has passed from chapter 4 to chapter 5, and even though it may be a few lines in your Bible, maybe it's a page turn or something along those lines, it's actually some time has passed because Jesus was way up north, and now he's come down south. Jesus went up to Jerusalem, because how many of you have ever been to Jerusalem? A few of you have been there, a few of you, okay, some of you have been there. Everybody goes up to Jerusalem because Jerusalem's on a hill. So you have to go up there to one of the Jewish festivals. That's what Jesus went to. Now there in Jerusalem near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda. Now we aren't exactly sure if Bethesda was the name of it then. It could have been Bethsaida, which is what others speculate. But we're going to call it Bethesda for the sake of our discussion. Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 colored colonnades. Now, what we have to know about this particular pool is that skeptics of the Bible used it for years as one of the reasons why you couldn't trust the Bible. Because it had never been discovered. It had never been actually, or should I say, identified, archaeologically speaking. But then in 2005, it was identified and it was excavated there in Jerusalem. Now, what else is unique about this particular pool is that it was fed by a reservoir that was outside of Jerusalem. And then also it was fed by a natural spring that was under Jerusalem. And that's important as well, because this natural spring, as you can imagine, would have moments of pressure, and these little gas bubbles would come up, and it would cause the water to ripple. And that's significant because at this pool, a great number of disabled people used to lie. The blind, the lame, the paralyzed. And why is it that they would lie there? Well, this isn't going to be a newsflash to you, but in the first century, we didn't know a lot about the body. We didn't know about the body because of technology. We also didn't know about the body for another reason, because there was a Roman law in this particular time that said you could not do an autopsy on a dead body. That once somebody died, you were done with the body. It needed to be buried, it needed to be dealt with, it needed to be taken away, but you could not cut into the body to find out what happened to the person. And so there's actually stories of doctors trying to get to somebody right before they died so that way they could be examined, because once they died, you couldn't examine the body anymore. And so in this particular day, you can imagine doctors were scary, first of all, and they were scarce, second of all. And so what did that create? Created an environment in which people were left to depend on traditions, mysticism, and whatever other solution that they could come up with on their own to resolve the problem that they had. And so the blind, the lame, the paralyzed were at this pool because there was a tradition that said an angel from the gods would come down and periodically would stir the water. And the first one, survival of the fittest in this moment, to get into the water would be healed. Now, there's no documentation that that ever took place. But you can imagine with that spring being under the water that every once in a while it would push forth enough air to stir the water. And after that, it was a free-for-all. Now, when I tell you that this was a place that people didn't want to go, I cannot emphasize that enough. This was a place that people did not want to go. They avoided it like the plague because it was like the plague. And every so often, an official would come from the city through this particular area, and they would pick up the dead bodies of the people who were not able to get healed there. And it's in this space that Jesus comes. And what we also have to understand, it was in this space that Jesus needed to come for us. Because we have a lot of solutions in our life too that are a bit godless. We have a problem, we have a concern, we have an anxiety, we have a grief. And what do we turn to? We'll turn to our horoscope. We will turn to constellations. We'll talk to our friends, send me some positive vibes, we'll request, because that's going to make a difference. We will try to, with our own ingenuity, our own creativity, our own work ethic, to fix our problems. And all along, there's like this God-shaped hole that's right there. And so what Jesus is doing is he is entering into this godless place, and people are just trying to find and trying to grab at anything they can to fix the problem that they've got in their lives. But what they're finding is that there's no solution in that water, and instead the solution is going to be right before them, and that solution is Jesus. And there at this place of Bethesda was a man who had been an invalid for 38 years. And so there was probably a time in his life he could walk, but now he can't. And he is living an awful existence. And when Jesus saw him lying there and he learned he had been there in this condition for a very long time, we don't know exactly why it is that Jesus took an interest in this man, but one reason that's speculated is that he was probably the oldest person there. And he had been there for 38 years. And with that, what that would have meant is the only way he could have got there is if a family member carried him, a friend carried him, perhaps somebody that wanted to take advantage of him carried him, or he just had to drag himself through the streets. Somebody in his condition would have normally had scars and scrapes and calluses all over their body, especially on their hands and their legs. And when Jesus comes to this pool, he sees this man who had been there for 38 years. Hoping, praying maybe, pleading with the gods to get better. And then Jesus sees him. And he asks him this very profound question. Do you want to get well? I mean, Jesus, isn't the answer obvious? Of course he wants to get well. Why wouldn't he want to get well? He's been there for 38 years. But sometimes the answer to that question isn't as obvious as we think. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the message and the point I'm trying to make today, but maybe that's why you're here today. Maybe that's a question that God is trying to ask you right now. Do you want to get well? Because we know sometimes it's a lot harder to get well than it is to stay sick. We know that sometimes it's a lot harder to ask for help than it is to show humility to get help, to get better. We know that sometimes we're going to get things. We're going to get things because we stay sick that if we get well, we won't get. And being somebody who is made in the image of God, being someone that God's hand is on, and just having you here right now in this place, listening to this message, God is asking you a question: do you want to get well? And maybe it's to do with your health, and you've got family members telling you that you can't eat that way anymore, and you need to exercise more. Or maybe you've got a doctor that's telling you he can't keep or she can't keep prescribing those medications to you. and you've got somebody in your life telling you that you can't drink that much anymore, and you know you can't drink that much anymore, or you've got family members that are telling you, we know your life is good, we know everything's going okay, but you are spiritually a mess. Spiritually, you are broken. Spiritually, you are sick. And God is sitting there asking you right now, do you want to get well? And so Jesus, in this moment, he probably leaned down to him and just whispered it because he didn't want to create a commotion. And he says, do you want to get well? And the man does. And so he says, sir, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. And this is an amazing environment, if you can imagine it in your head. It truly is a Darwinian moment in which it is survival of the fittest. People are pulling whenever those waters get stirred and tugging and climbing over one another. And probably at times, multiples of them fall into the water at the exact same time. Some have probably even drowned in those waters. And he's saying, I just can't ever get there. And Jesus probably nodded and said, okay. And he might have even said, you know what? There's nothing in that water for you. Everything you need is right here with me. And so get up. Get up. And in the original Greek language, that word get up, it could be translated rise up, wake up, come to life, because he's not just speaking to this man in a physical sense, he's also speaking to him in a spiritual sense. In the same way, he's speaking to every single one of us in a spiritual sense, that when we are truly willing to remove ourselves from those situations, because we all know that there are people, and maybe you've even been one, and maybe you are one, in which you are more comfortable with a chaotic, dysfunctional situation than you are with a healthy one. And so when Jesus looked at that man and he said, do you want to get well? He's really asking him, do you want to get out of this? Because maybe you've worked with people from time to time who they'll create dysfunction. You worked for somebody that wanted to create chaos because he didn't want the situation or she didn't want the situation to be smooth and everything to go well. They only knew how to function except in an environment that was just an absolute mess. And in this case, this man is saying, no, I want out of this situation. I don't want to stay here anymore. I don't care how long I've been here. This is not the place I want to remain. And so Jesus says, get up, rise up, come to life. This is not where you're going to stay. And so he says, pick up your mat and walk. And it's right here that we see that Jesus isn't just performing a random act of kindness, although he is performing a random act of kindness. He says, I want you to pick up that mat. I read someone say, where your bed is, there your home will be also. And what Jesus is telling this man is your home has been a place of despair, and now we're going to make it a place of hope. And so I want you to pick up that mat. And this thing that has mocked you your entire life, this thing that has carried you your entire life, I want you to now carry it. Because of me, because I'm a part of your life, you're going to pick up that mat, throw it up on your shoulder, and you're going to begin to walk. And at once, for 38 years, he has waited. Some of you are waiting. You've been waiting for 38 minutes. Some of you have been waiting for maybe 38 weeks, or maybe you've even been waiting for 38 months. Whatever it is, you've been waiting on God to do something. When God does it, it happens instantaneously. Sometimes it takes a long time for God to move quickly. At once, the man was cured, and he picked up his mat, and he walked. And this next verse is real important for us to understand what it is that is going on here from a big picture standpoint. The day on which this took place was the Sabbath. There was a lot of things you couldn't do on the Sabbath. In fact, there were 39 categories of things, not 39 things, 39 categories of a list of things that you could not do on the Sabbath. Now, all of those did not come down from Mount Sinai in written form from Moses, but there's what's known as the oral law that's been passed down through the ages that has now come into the first century. And what's happened is that these laws are being so adhered to, these commandments are such a priority that no one is receiving any compassion as they're being shared with others. And so on this day, it was the Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to this man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." Well, it really wasn't the law. It wasn't Moses' law. It wasn't from the Torah. It was their law. It was the oral law that had been passed down. But these men had forgotten a very important point, that the purpose of the Sabbath was to give you a break from labor, not a break from love. The purpose of the Sabbath was to give you a break from your work, not to give you a break from caring for other people. And so how does the man respond? What does he say? He said, "The man who made me well, said to me, 'Pick up the mat and walk.'" You know what he's saying? He's saying, "I know what the law is. And I know what you tell me I can't do. In fact, you've been telling me I couldn't do things for the last 38 years. For 38 years, you've ignored me. You've walked over me. You've never even acknowledged me. And you certainly haven't helped me or cared for me or demonstrated 1 ounce of compassion to me as I have laid next to this pool." What he's telling them is, I have for 38 years listened to you tell me how I deserved what it is that I've gotten because I have sinned, or my mother sinned, or my father sinned. There's so much sin in my life that I have been an invalid for 38 years. And you know what? Maybe I did deserve it. But I'm going to follow the one who treats me like I don't deserve. And so he told me to pick up my mat, and I picked it up, and I'm going straight to that temple. And so they asked him, they were stunned, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick up and walk? Who is this fellow who is this lawbreaker, this Sabbath defier? Who is this person that could have waited one more day to heal you? Who is this man? We want his name. We're making a list." And the man said, I don't know who he is. I have no idea. For Jesus had slipped away into the crowd. He didn't want any credit. And so the man finds himself at the temple. And this is what there's a bit of debate as to what this next verse really means. And so I'm going to share with you what I think that it means. It's a bit of a different translation than you're probably going to read about in a commentary. And a commentary is what a theologian writes about particular passages and doctrines of the Bible. And so I'm going to read this to you, but I'm going to read it to you and explain it to you from the way that I understand it, because I'm not reading it like a theologian. I'm reading it like a human. And so the man goes to the temple, and it's there that Jesus finds him. And I think that Jesus at this moment probably threw his arm around him. And he's standing there with him because this man hasn't been standing for 38 years. And he says to him, "See, you're well again." And he would have known that they were accusing him of being a sinner, because that was kind of Jesus' point. That they were so focused on honoring the Sabbath that they weren't willing to love this man and help him and show him compassion. So he throws his arm around him. He's probably got his hand right on top of that mat that they were just scolding him about. And he says, "Stop sinning." All right, you didn't get it. Okay. "Stop sinning, you sinner, you lawbreaker, you person that's defiled the Sabbath. You stop it, or something worse may happen to you." And they both would have been a ha, 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 because for 38 years, the man hasn't had anything happen to him. And he hasn't done anything wrong. In fact, he hasn't done anything for 38 years. And nothing could have been worse than what it is that he's experienced for the last 38 years. I mean, what were they really going to do to Jesus? What were they really going to do to Jesus and to this man at this point? Tell him he couldn't go to the temple, the place he hasn't gone to in 38 years? I think this is just Jesus being a bit sarcastic. And he's saying, "Oh, you stop sinning, you sinner, you. Something else worse might happen to you." And they both would have chuckled and laughed and just went on their way. There's something that happens whenever you really encounter Jesus. The fear goes away. And you stop worrying about so many things in life, because whenever you really encounter him, you realize that there's nothing in this world that he can't get you through, and there's certainly nothing in this world that he can't handle. And these things that we worry about, whatever they may be, maybe it's a family issue, maybe it's a work issue, maybe it's a political issue, maybe it's a legislative issue, We realize that we don't have to be scared anymore. It may be something that we need to be concerned about. It may be something we need to do something about. It may be something that we need to try to influence, but we don't have to be scared anymore. And this man, he's not scared of the religious leaders anymore. He just kind of shrugs them off and goes on about his way. He literally carried the mat into the temple. He's not worried, because there's something that just happens to us like that whenever we really encounter Jesus. And one of the things that definitely happens is that God's kingdom expands. I'm going to give you 3 quick little takeaways here of what happens whenever God's kingdom advances through compassion. First of all, compassion, whenever it's really in your heart, it'll take you to people and places you would not normally want to go. Maybe it'll take you to a jail. Maybe it'll take you to a hospital. Maybe it'll take you to a school. It might even take you to a table where you have to sit down with somebody who doesn't agree with you politically. And they don't like the way that you approach COVID. And maybe they don't like the way that you vote. And they don't like the way that you raise your kids. But in that moment, compassion will take you there. And you don't have to be angry, and you don't have to be worried, and you certainly don't have to be scared. And maybe, just maybe in that moment, there's some truth of God's word that can be shared. Compassion is something that also takes an odd turn, because sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is get well. Because you don't really realize how much the people in your life you are hurting when you aren't well. And you want to know why it is that God just keeps on knocking on the door of your heart. And you want to know why it is that you're even here right now. It's because people in your life are praying that you would get better. It's because God is asking you, do you want to get well? And the last thing that we see with compassion is that it paves the way for God's truth, the truth that our world so desperately needs. And here's what's amazing, is what's going to set us free. It's not going to be those officials that we vote for, and it's not going to be another argument. It's not going to be a snide remark. What's going to set you free is Jesus. And it's the truth that he brings, because the truth will always set us free.